The encounter. The sun peeked through a canopy of green leaves, casting playful shadows on the manicured park pathways. Families strolled hand in hand. Children giggled as they chased one another, and the soft hum of a street musician's melody lingered in the air. Amid this scene of warmth and serenity, Elizabeth Darnell stepped onto the park terrace with an air of authority, her presence like a splash of cold water against the cheerful ambience. Elizabeth, a woman of wealth and influence, was adorned in a tailored dress of pristine white silk, her wrists jingling with the faint chime of gold bracelets. Her every movement exuded a haughty elegance, her sharp eyes scanning her surroundings with a mixture of boredom and contempt. She had come to the park for no particular reason, other than to escape the suffocating confines of her estate. But as always, she craved attention and control, two commodities she wielded with ease. She paused near the edge of the terrace, her gaze landing on a small gathering of people by the fountain. Their laughter and animated chatter should have been comforting, but to Elizabeth, it was an annoyance. She turned to her companion, a similarly polished woman named Vivian, who always seemed to trail behind her like a shadow. "Why is this park becoming so eclectic?" Elizabeth muttered, her disdain barely hidden. "It used to be a refuge for people like us. Now look." Vivian hesitated before replying. "It's open to everyone, Elizabeth." Elizabeth's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Precisely my point." As her eyes scanned the park again, they stopped abruptly on an unexpected figure. A boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, sat in a wheelchair beneath a tree. His frame was slight, his clothes plain and worn, and in his lap rested a sketchbook. He was entirely absorbed in his work, a pencil moving swiftly across the page. His head bowed so that a curtain of unkempt hair obscured his face. Elizabeth's smirk deepened. "And what do we have here?" she said aloud, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "A little artist in the making." The boy didn't look up. His focus remained steadfast, though his grip on the pencil seemed to tighten. Elizabeth stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the stone pavement, drawing the attention of passers-by. Vivian followed hesitantly, her expression shifting to discomfort. "Do you think he's drawing something important?" Elizabeth mused mockingly, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe he's trying to capture his tragic little life in art." "How quaint." "Elizabeth," Vivian whispered, glancing nervously at the boy. "Maybe we should leave him be." "Nonsense," Elizabeth replied, brushing off the suggestion. "Children like him need to learn their place. They shouldn't be cluttering spaces meant for real people." As her words hung in the air, a hush seemed to fall over the immediate area. A few onlookers turned their heads, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. Yet the boy remained silent, his pencil dancing faster across the page, as if trying to escape the cruel reality through his art. Elizabeth, emboldened by his lack of response, leaned forward slightly, trying to peer at his drawing. "Show us what you're working on, little one," she said, her tone biting. "Or are you afraid it's as unimpressive as?" The boy's head snapped up, and their eyes met. For a moment, Elizabeth faltered. His gaze was piercing, not with anger, but with a quiet defiance that caught her off guard. His dark eyes seemed to hold the weight of experiences far beyond his years, as if he had seen and endured more than she could fathom. It wasn't the look of a child. It was the look of someone who had been hardened by life's cruelties yet refused to crumble under them. But the moment passed quickly, and Elizabeth's composure returned. She straightened, scoffing lightly. "Well, I suppose silence is the only answer you have. How predictable." The boy lowered his gaze and resumed his drawing, his pencil moving with renewed determination. His silence was unyielding, his focus unbroken, and in that stillness, he wielded a power Elizabeth couldn't comprehend. Vivian tugged at Elizabeth's sleeve. "Let's go," she whispered, her voice urgent. But Elizabeth lingered, her sharp eyes still on the boy. She wasn't used to being ignored, and the boy's quiet resistance felt like an affront to her authority. It unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. "Come on, Elizabeth," Vivian urged again. He's just a kid. Exactly, Elizabeth replied, her tone icy. And he needs to learn that in this world, weakness is not rewarded. With that, she turned on her heel, her bracelets jingling faintly as she strode away. Vivian followed, glancing back at the boy one last time. He remained as he was, drawing silently beneath the tree, his wheelchair framed by dappled sunlight. As they disappeared from view, the boy's pencil stilled. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, drawing in a shaky breath. Then, with renewed resolve, he turned the page and began again. Each line he drew was not just an expression of art, but an act of defiance, a silent protest against the voices that sought to diminish him. Unbeknownst to Elizabeth, this was only the beginning. What started as a cruel encounter would soon unravel her carefully constructed world and reveal truths she had spent a lifetime ignoring. The first ripple. The days following her encounter with the boy were supposed to be routine for Elizabeth Darnell, a sequence of carefully curated events that kept her at the center of her pristine social circle. Yet the boy's quiet defiance lingered in her mind like an itch she couldn't scratch. It wasn't just his gaze. It was the fact that he didn't respond, didn't flinch. He had faced her mockery as if she were the insignificant one, and that thought alone gnawed at her. Elizabeth told herself it didn't matter. The boy was just another nobody cluttering a world meant for people like her. Still, she found herself recalling the way his pencil had moved with such determination, as though the very act of drawing was his lifeline. On a crisp morning, she found herself back at the park, her heels clicking against the stone pathway. It wasn't intentional, at least, that's what she told herself. She needed fresh air, and the park was convenient. Her usual coffee shop had been too crowded. Yet, as her eyes scanned the familiar scenery, she caught sight of the boy beneath the same tree. He was alone again, his wheelchair positioned in the shade, and his focus was locked on the sketchbook resting in his lap. This time, there was no Vivian to follow her and no audience to cheer her on. For a fleeting moment, Elizabeth considered walking away, ignoring him entirely. But the quiet curiosity that had nagged at her since their last meeting pulled her forward. She approached slowly, her movements unusually hesitant. As she neared, she noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before. The boy's frail hands, the way his thin shoulders hunched slightly over the sketchbook. His clothing was even more threadbare than she remembered. It made him seem smaller, weaker. And yet, the intensity with which he worked made it impossible to dismiss him. Still at it. "I see," she said, her voice breaking the silence. The boy didn't look up. His pencil didn't pause. Elizabeth frowned, unused to being ignored. "What are you drawing this time?" "Another masterpiece." Still, no response. She moved closer until she was standing directly in his line of sight. She glanced down at his sketchbook, expecting to see another attempt at something lofty and ambitious, something to mock. What she saw, however, was different. It was a portrait of an elderly man sitting on a park bench, his shoulders stooped, his face etched with years of hardship. The lines on his face were so vivid that Elizabeth could almost feel his exhaustion. There was a tenderness to the drawing, a humanity that she hadn't expected. For a moment, she was at a loss for words. Then, regaining her composure, she said, "You're wasting your time, you know. Nobody buys art from children. Especially children, whoa." She caught herself before finishing the sentence. The boy finally looked up. His dark eyes, as piercing as they had been before, met hers again. This time, however, they weren't just defiant. There was something else in them, something sharper. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then returned to his drawing without a word. Elizabeth felt a flash of irritation. "You're quite rude, you know that. I'm trying to have a conversation with you, and you're just." "Why?" he said suddenly, his voice quiet but steady. The single word caught her off guard. "Why what?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Why do you care?" He didn't look up this time, his pencil still moving across the page. Elizabeth bristled. "Care? I don't care. I'm merely curious." The boy smirked faintly, though his eyes remained on the paper. You wouldn't understand. The audacity of his words stung. She folded her arms, standing tall. And what exactly wouldn't I understand? Art? Struggle? I've lived a life, boy. I understand more than you think. He paused his drawing again and looked up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. You think struggle is something you can understand by watching it from a distance, but you don't know what it feels like, do you? To have the world look at you and decide you're not enough before you even say a word. Elizabeth opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The boy's steady gaze pinned her in place, and for the first time, she felt an unfamiliar unease. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. She was supposed to be the one in control. Who taught you to talk like that? She asked, her voice cooler now, an edge of defensiveness creeping in. The boy shrugged and went back to his drawing. No one taught me. I've just been listening. To what? To people like you. The words were like a slap, but Elizabeth forced herself to remain composed. She didn't know why she was still standing there, why she hadn't walked away yet. Something about the boy, his quiet confidence, his refusal to be intimidated, unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. I could help you, you know, she said after a moment, her tone softer now. I know people, galleries, art schools. If you worked with the right mentors, you could actually do something with this. The boy stopped drawing again, but this time he didn't look at her. I don't need your help. You're being foolish, Elizabeth said, her frustration mounting. You think you can just sit here and draw your way into a better life. The world doesn't work that way. He looked up, his gaze steady once more. Maybe it doesn't work that way for you. For a moment, they stared at each other, the silence between them heavy in charge. Then, without another word, the boy closed his sketchbook and began wheeling himself away. Elizabeth stood frozen, watching him go. She wanted to call after him, to say something cutting or dismissive, but the words wouldn't come. As she turned to leave the park, she realized something unsettling. Her hands were trembling. She stuffed them into her pockets, willing herself to regain her composure. This was absurd. He was just a boy, a child who knew nothing about the real world. And yet, he had managed to make her feel small. That night, Elizabeth found herself unable to sleep. The boy's words echoed in her mind, his drawings etched into her memory. For the first time in years, she felt doubt creeping into the corners of her carefully constructed world. She tried to dismiss it, but the seed had been planted, and it was growing. The drawing that spoke. The next morning, Elizabeth awoke in a haze. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind racing with fragments of the previous day's encounter. Her carefully cultivated world, a fortress of wealth, power, and control, seemed strangely fragile now. No matter how much she tried to dismiss the boy in the wheelchair as insignificant, his words and the piercing calm in his eyes had left an undeniable mark. She pushed herself out of bed and into her usual morning routine. Her assistant had already prepared her schedule for the day. A meeting with the city's art committee, a charity luncheon, and an evening gala. These were the events where Elizabeth shone brightest, commanding rooms with her elegance and icy charm. But today, even as she slipped into an exquisite designer dress and adorned herself with jewels, she felt oddly unsettled. By the time she arrived at the luncheon, Elizabeth had regained some of her composure. She breezed into the private dining room, her presence turning heads as it always did. The city's elite were gathered around the long table, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. Elizabeth's name alone carried enough weight to silence conversations as she approached. "Elizabeth, darling." A well-dressed woman cooed as she embraced her. "You look radiant as ever." "Of course," Elizabeth replied with a practiced smile. She took her seat at the head of the table, ready to steer the conversation as she always did. But just as she was about to launch into her thoughts on the city's new cultural initiatives, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. It was a drawing, Propped against the wall near the buffet table was an enlarged print of the boy's sketch from the park, the portrait of the elderly man. The one Elizabeth had dismissed as a waste of time now commanded the attention of everyone in the room. The intricate details, the depth of emotion captured in those pencil strokes, made it impossible to look away. "Beautiful, isn't it?" one of the women remarked, her voice hushed with admiration. "They say it was drawn by a young boy. Remarkable talent." Elizabeth's chest tightened. She forced herself to smile, though her fingers gripped the stem of her champagne glass with alarming force. "A boy, you say?" she asked, her voice feigning casual interest. "Do we know who he is?" "No one seems to know much," the woman replied. "Apparently, someone discovered him drawing in the park and shared his work online. It's been going viral. Everyone's talking about it." Elizabeth felt her heart quicken. Viral? She had underestimated him. She had assumed his art would remain confined to the pages of his sketchbook, unseen and unimportant. But now, here it was, being celebrated in the very circles she dominated. "Such raw talent," another guest chimed in. "And to think, he's just a child." Elizabeth's smile faltered. The conversation around the table shifted, with everyone marveling at the boy's work and speculating about his future. Some suggested scholarships, others debated which galleries would be interested in showcasing his art. The admiration in their voices was palpable, and Elizabeth felt a strange mix of envy and dread creeping in. She excused herself, retreating to the corner of the room where the drawing stood. Up close, it was even more haunting. The lines were precise yet filled with emotion, each stroke carrying a weight that Elizabeth couldn't ignore. She stared at it, searching for flaws, something to diminish its impact. But there was none. "What do you think of it, Elizabeth?" a familiar voice asked. She turned to see Charles, one of the city's most influential art collectors, standing beside her. His sharp eyes were fixed on the drawing, his expression one of genuine admiration. "It's intriguing," Elizabeth replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Though I wonder if it's not a bit exaggerated." Charles chuckled. "Oh, come now. You can't deny the skill here. Whoever this boy is, he's captured something profound. It's rare to see such authenticity in art these days." Elizabeth bristled but masked it with a polite nod. "Perhaps," she said, "but authenticity doesn't always equate to greatness." Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Greatness, my dear, often begins in the most unexpected places." His words lingered in the air as he walked away, leaving Elizabeth alone with the drawing. She stared at it, her thoughts swirling. For years, she had prided herself on being a task-maker, someone who dictated what was valuable and what wasn't. But now, a boy in a wheelchair had created something that threatened to overshadow her carefully constructed influence. That evening, Elizabeth attended the gala with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. The boy's drawing had followed her, not physically, but in whispers and conversations. Everywhere she turned, someone was mentioning his work. It was as though his art had cast a spell on the city, and she couldn't escape it. As the night wore on, she overheard a group of guests discussing the boy again. This time, the focus wasn't just on his talent, it was on his story. People were speculating about his background, his struggles, and what had inspired his art. The more they talked, the more Elizabeth felt the walls closing in. By the time she returned home, Elizabeth was seething. She paced her luxurious study, the heels of her shoes clicking against the marble floor. The boy had become a symbol of something she couldn't control, a force that defied her usual tactics of dismissal and disdain. She couldn't ignore him, but she also couldn't confront him directly without risking her own image. As she poured herself a glass of wine, her mind raced with possibilities. She needed to reclaim her power, to remind the world who she was. But deep down, a part of her knew that the boy had already done something she couldn't undo. He had shown her the truth, not just about himself, but about her. And the truth, as it turned out, was far more unsettling than she had ever imagined. The turning point. The morning after the gala, Elizabeth sat in her expansive study, bathed in the golden light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The beauty of the room, its gleaming mahogany desk, intricate Persian rug, and meticulously arranged shelves of leather-bound books, offered no comfort. For the first time in years, she felt adrift. Her mind was consumed by the boy and the drawing that had captured the attention of an entire city. She tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on her day. Her assistant had already prepared the itinerary: meetings with investors, a photo shoot for a charity campaign, and a dinner with a potential partner for her next business venture. But none of it held her attention. The boy's piercing gaze, the quiet defiance in his silence, and the haunting beauty of his work gnawed at her. By midday, Elizabeth found herself walking through the park again, drawn there by an impulse she didn't fully understand. She told herself it was merely curiosity, a need to confirm whether he was still there, still drawing. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She needed answers, answers she wasn't even sure she was ready to face. As she approached the familiar path, her heart quickened. There he was, in the same spot beneath the tree, his wheelchair slightly angled to catch the sunlight. His sketchbook rested in his lap, and his pencil moved with quiet determination. Around him, a small crowd had gathered, watching him work in silence. The air was thick with awe and curiosity. Elizabeth hesitated, feeling an unfamiliar pang of self-doubt. She wasn't used to being just another face in the crowd. Steeling herself, she moved closer, her heels clicking softly on the stone path. The boy didn't look up, but a few members of the crowd turned to glance at her. Some recognized her from the gala or her frequent appearances in society pages. Their expressions shifted: curiosity, hesitation, even judgment. She felt their eyes on her, and for once it unsettled her. One woman, clutching a young child by the hand, whispered to her companion. Elizabeth caught fragments of the conversation. The woman from the drawing. You can see it. Her chest tightened. Was it true? Had the boy drawn her too? The thought both terrified and intrigued her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. The crowd parted slightly, giving her a clear view of the boy. He still didn't look up, his focus unbroken. Elizabeth cleared her throat. "I see you're still at it," she said, her tone a blend of forced casualness and thinly veiled irritation. The boy paused his drawing, but didn't raise his head. "Why are you here?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. The question caught her off guard. "I could ask you the same thing," she retorted, crossing her arms. "Why spend your days sitting here, scribbling in that book?" He finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. The intensity of his gaze was almost unbearable. "Because it's what I do," he said simply. "Why are you here?" "To mock me again." Elizabeth felt a flush rise to her cheeks. The crowd was silent, their attention fixed on the exchange. She hated how exposed she felt, how the boy's quiet strength seemed to strip away her usual defenses. "I came to understand," she said, the words awkward and foreign on her tongue. "Your drawings, they've captured attention. People are talking about you. And," his voice was calm, almost disinterested, "and I wanted to know why," she said, struggling to maintain her composure. "Why do you draw? What do you hope to achieve?" The boy's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "I don't draw to achieve anything. I draw because it's the only way I can speak." Elizabeth frowned. "Speak. You're speaking now." "Words don't always work," he replied. "People don't listen. They see what they want to see, hear what they want to hear. But when I draw, they can't ignore it." His words struck a chord she hadn't expected. She thought back to the drawing at the gala. The way it had silenced even the most critical voices. It wasn't just art. It was a mirror reflecting truths that people, including herself, preferred to avoid. "I see," she said softly, though she wasn't sure she did. "And what truth are you trying to show?" The boy's gaze didn't waver. "The truth that people like you don't want to see." The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, she was speechless. The crowd murmured again, their whispers like a tide rising around her. She felt their eyes, their judgment, and she hated it. She hated how powerless she felt in the face of this boy who had nothing and yet seemed to hold all the power. "I'd like to see your work," she said suddenly, trying to regain control. "All of it. Perhaps I can help you. Arrange for it to be shown in a proper gallery." The boy tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Why would you do that?" "Because," she hesitated, searching for the right words, "because I believe in supporting talent, and you clearly have talent." He held her gaze for a long moment, then shook his head. "You don't believe in me. You just want to control the story." The accusation stung because it was true. Elizabeth had built her life on controlling narratives, shaping the world to fit her image of perfection. But this boy, with his unshakable calm and unflinching honesty, refused to be shaked. The crowd began to disperse, sensing the tension between them. Elizabeth stood frozen, watching as the boy returned to his sketchbook, his pencil moving with renewed focus. She felt like a stranger in her own skin, unsure of what to do or say. As she turned to leave, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The boy didn't look up, but his drawing, the image slowly taking shape on the page, stopped her in her tracks. It was a scene from the park, but the figures were distorted, their faces blurred. In the center, a lone figure stood tall, her posture proud but her face hidden in shadow. It was her. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to demand an explanation, to confront him, but she knew it would be futile. The boy's art spoke louder than any words ever could. As she walked away, her heels echoing on the stone path, she realized that something had shifted within her. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her own reflection, the cracks in the perfect image she had worked so hard to maintain. And she wasn't sure she liked what she saw. The unraveling. The days that followed were a blur for Elizabeth. What had once been a life meticulously curated, filled with high society engagements, charity galas, and unshakable authority, now felt like it was slipping through her fingers. The boy's words and his drawings haunted her, creeping into her thoughts at the most unexpected moments. In her study, late one night, she pored over news articles and social media posts about him. The boy's drawings were everywhere now, shared millions of times across platforms, accompanied by captions praising his raw talent and the profound truths embedded in his work. Each image told a story of isolation, of prejudice, of strength born from pain. People from all walks of life were resonating with his art, and it was unsettling how deeply it cut through the veneer of Elizabeth's world. But what unsettled her most were the whispers surrounding her. People were beginning to draw connections between the boy's art and her identity. The figures in his drawings, cold, aloof, and cloaked in shadows, were unmistakably her. It was a version of herself she barely recognized, yet she couldn't deny its accuracy. The phone call. One morning, Elizabeth's phone buzzed incessantly. She ignored it at first, assuming it was yet another charity organizer or socialite clamoring for her attention. But when the buzzing didn't stop, she finally picked it up. "Elizabeth Darnell speaking," she said curtly. "Elizabeth, it's Charles," came the voice on the other end. His usual confidence was tinged with something uncharacteristic. Hesitation. "Charles," she replied, her tone guarded. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" There was a pause. "Have you seen the latest?" "The latest what?" "The boy's newest drawing. It's you." Elizabeth's stomach tightened. "I'm aware," she said, trying to sound indifferent. "No, Elizabeth, you don't understand. It's you. Entirely. Not just a figure in the background or a shadowed silhouette. It's a portrait. And it's—" He trailed off. "What?" She snapped. "What is it?" "It's devastating," he said softly. "You should come to the gallery. Everyone's talking about it." At the gallery. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth found herself standing outside the gallery, her hands trembling as she gripped the door handle. She had told herself she wasn't coming, that she didn't care what the boy had drawn. But something had pulled her here, curiosity, perhaps, or fear. As she stepped inside, the buzz of conversation hit her like a wave. The space was crowded, filled with people of all ages and backgrounds, their faces alight with emotion. At the center of the room, displayed prominently, was the drawing Charles had mentioned. Elizabeth froze. It was her. The portrait was achingly vivid, capturing her in a way no photograph or painted commission ever had. But it wasn't the Elizabeth she knew. This version of herself was stripped bare, her carefully cultivated poise and elegance replaced by raw, unfiltered emotion. Her face was drawn with stark lines, her eyes hollow and tired, as though they had seen too much and yet understood too little. Around her were the faint outlines of others, figures she had dismissed or ignored, their faces blurred but their presence undeniable. The most striking part, however, was her posture. She stood tall, as she always did, but the tilt of her head and the curve of her shoulders told a different story. It was as though she was weighed down by the very things she had spent her life using to lift herself above others. Her wealth, her power, her pride. For a long moment, Elizabeth couldn't breathe. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, though no one approached. Whispers floated through the room, words she couldn't quite make out but knew were about her. She wanted to leave, to escape this public unraveling, but her feet wouldn't move. "Powerful, isn't it?" a voice said softly beside her. She turned to see a young woman, her face thoughtful as she gazed at the portrait. "You can see everything in her," the woman continued. "Her strength, her vulnerability, even her flaws. It's honest in a way most art isn't." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She wanted to snap back, to defend herself, but the words caught in her chest. For the first time, she couldn't summon the armor she always wore. Confrontation. Elizabeth left the gallery in a daze, her heart pounding. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could provide them. Without hesitation, she returned to the park, her steps quick and purposeful. The boy was there, as she knew he would be. He sat beneath the tree, his sketchbook balanced on his lap, his pencil moving in the same deliberate rhythm. This time, there was no crowd, just the two of them. "You've gone too far," Elizabeth said, her voice sharp. The boy looked up, his expression calm. "Have I?" "Yes," she snapped. "That drawing, the one in the gallery. You had no right." The boy tilted his head slightly, studying her. "I had every right." Elizabeth's fists clenched at her sides. "You don't know me. You don't know my life. How dare you think you can?" "I know what I see," he interrupted, his voice steady. "And so do you." She froze, his words cutting through her anger like a knife. "What's that supposed to mean?" she demanded. "You see it, don't you?" he said, his gaze unwavering. "The version of yourself you've tried to bury. The one who's scared, lonely, and desperate to matter." Elizabeth recoiled as though he had struck her. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," he said quietly. "I know you've spent your life building walls to keep people out. But those walls don't protect you. They trap you." For a moment, Elizabeth couldn't speak. She felt as though the boy had reached into her chest and pulled out a truth she had spent decades hiding, even from herself. "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" The boy looked down at his sketchbook, then back at her. "Because you needed to see it." Elizabeth's knees felt weak, and she sank onto the bench beside him. The anger and indignation that had brought her here were gone, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Vulnerability, shame, perhaps even hope. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth didn't have the answers. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted them. The unraveling. The silence between them was heavy, punctuated only by the soft rustle of leaves overhead and the distant hum of the park. Elizabeth sat on the bench, her posture rigid despite the weight pressing down on her chest. The boy didn't speak, didn't move, only watched her with that unnervingly calm expression. His presence was quiet yet overwhelming, as though he could see through the layers of defenses she had so carefully constructed over the years. She struggled to gather her thoughts, to find the right words to reassert herself. But every time she opened her mouth, the drawing from the gallery loomed in her mind, vivid and unrelenting. It was as if that version of herself, the one she had hidden from the world, was staring back at her now through his dark, knowing eyes. "I don't need your pity," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. The boy's lips quirked into the faintest hint of a smile, not mocking, but understanding. "Good," he said, "because I'm not giving it to you." His response caught her off guard. She had expected condescension or defiance, something that would reaffirm her belief that he was just a rebellious child trying to provoke her. But there was none of that. Instead, he spoke with a clarity and confidence that made her feel as though she were the child in this exchange. "Then what are you giving me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. "Perspective," he said simply. "And maybe a chance." Elizabeth frowned. "A chance? For what?" "To change," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "To see things differently. To be someone different." She let out a bitter laugh. "You think a drawing can do that?" "I think the truth can," he said. "And you saw it, didn't you?" His words hung in the air, and Elizabeth couldn't deny their weight. She had seen it, her reflection in his art, stripped of the facade she had worked so hard to maintain. The drawing didn't just expose her flaws, it forced her to confront them, and in doing so, it had stirred something within her that she hadn't felt in years. Doubt. "I don't need to change," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I've built a life most people could only dream of." "I've built walls," the boy interrupted. "You've built walls, not a life." His words stung because they carried a truth she couldn't deny. She had spent decades constructing a fortress of wealth, influence, and power, convinced it would shield her from the vulnerability and pain she despised. But now, sitting here, confronted by this boy and his unshakable honesty, she realized that her fortress was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy's gaze softened, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of something in his eyes. Compassion, perhaps, or understanding. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "This isn't about me. It's about you." Elizabeth looked away, her hands clenched in her lap. She hated the way his words made her feel, exposed, vulnerable, and small. But she also couldn't ignore the faint stirrings of something else deep within her, the possibility that he might be right. The memory. As the boy resumed his drawing, Elizabeth's thoughts drifted back to a memory she had buried long ago. She was 15, standing in the hallway of her private school, her arms full of books. A group of girls stood nearby, their laughter echoing through the corridor. They were the daughters of the city's wealthiest families, their confidence unshakable, their beauty effortless. Elizabeth had wanted desperately to be one of them, to belong. But she didn't. "Look at her," one of the girls had said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Who does she think she is? Those shoes are at least 2 seasons old." The others laughed, and Elizabeth had felt the sting of their words like a slap. She had fled to the bathroom, her cheeks burning with humiliation. It was the first time she had understood what it meant to be judged, to be deemed unworthy. And it was the moment she had vowed never to let anyone make her feel that way again. That vow had shaped her entire life. She had clawed her way to the top, using every resource at her disposal to ensure that she would never be the one standing in the corner, mocked and ignored. But now, sitting on this bench, she realized that the very thing she had fought against was what she had become. A small gesture. "I don't even know your name," Elizabeth said suddenly, breaking the silence. The boy glanced at her, his pencil still moving across the page. "James," he said. James, she repeated, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. I know who you are, he interrupted. Everyone knows who you are. His tone wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't reverent either. It was simply matter of fact, as though her identity was as unremarkable as the weather. And for some reason, that hurt more than anything else. She hesitated, unsure of what to say next. For years, she had wielded her name like a weapon, a symbol of her power and status. But here, in this moment, it felt like an empty shell. "Do you ever sell your drawings?" she asked, her voice cautious. James shook his head. "They're not for selling." "Why not?" "Because they're not about money," he said. "They're about meaning." Elizabeth felt a pang of discomfort at his words. Her entire life had been built around money, around the belief that it could solve any problem, buy any solution. But James's refusal to reduce his art to a commodity was a reminder of everything she had lost in her pursuit of power: authenticity, passion, and the ability to see the world through anything other than a transactional lens. After a long pause, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook and pen. She hesitated, then began to write something down. When she was finished, she tore the page out and held it out to him. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing the paper warily. "My number," she said. "If you ever decide you want to share your work on a larger scale, or if you ever just want to talk." James studied her for a moment, then took the paper without a word. He tucked it into his sketchbook and resumed drawing, his focus unbroken. Elizabeth watched him for a moment longer, then stood and walked away. As she left the park, she felt lighter somehow, as though a burden she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure where she was going, and for the first time, that uncertainty felt like a beginning rather than an end. The beginning of change. Elizabeth didn't return to the park for several weeks. She told herself it was because she was busy. Meetings, events, obligations piling up like always. But deep down, she knew the truth. She wasn't ready. Not ready to face James again, not ready to confront the cracks in the carefully constructed facade of her life. The city, however, refused to let her forget. James's work was everywhere now, his drawings a phenomenon that had transcended the boundaries of art circles and entered the public consciousness. His sketches, shared online and displayed in pop-up exhibitions, had become a symbol of resilience, of the silent strength that existed in overlooked corners of the world. Each new piece was dissected, praised, and celebrated, and with every conversation, Elizabeth's name inevitably arose, though not in the way she was accustomed to. He drew her. People would say, "That woman, the one with the cold eyes." The judgment stung more than she wanted to admit. For years, Elizabeth had basked in her reputation as a taskmaker, a force to be reckoned with. Now, she had become something else entirely, a symbol of everything James's art stood against, and it wasn't just strangers who noticed. At luncheons, at galas, in hushed conversations among her peers, she felt the shift. The polite smiles were still there, but they no longer reached people's eyes. One evening, as Elizabeth sat alone in her opulent study, she stared at the framed accolades that lined her walls. The awards, the photos with dignitaries, the magazine covers. Once, they had filled her with pride. Now they felt hollow, their sheen dulled by the weight of her own reflection. She thought of James's drawings, of the raw honesty they conveyed, and for the first time, she envied him. He had nothing, and yet he had everything that mattered. The unexpected call. The phone call came late on a quiet Thursday evening. Elizabeth had been sitting by the window, nursing a glass of wine and staring out at the glittering city skyline. When her phone buzzed, she almost ignored it, but something compelled her to answer. "Elizabeth Darnell," she said, her tone crisp. There was a pause on the other end. Then, a familiar voice said, "It's James." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected to hear from him again. "James," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "This is unexpected." You said I could call, he replied simply. Yes, of course, she said quickly, setting her glass down. Is everything all right? Another pause. There's an exhibition, he said. This weekend. It's mine. Elizabeth blinked. Your exhibition. That's incredible. Congratulations. He didn't acknowledge the compliment. You should come. The invitation caught her off guard. She had expected anger, defiance, perhaps even indifference from him. Not this. Are you sure? She asked, her voice softer now. I mean, given everything. You need to see it, he said. There was something in his tone that left no room for argument. Before she could ask for details, he hung up, leaving her alone with her thoughts. For a long time, she sat there, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't sure why he wanted her there, but she knew she couldn't refuse. The exhibition. The gallery was modest, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't the grand, glittering venue Elizabeth was used to, but it hummed with an energy she hadn't felt in years. The space was packed, the air alive with murmured conversations, and the occasional gasp of awe. The walls were lined with James's drawings, each one more powerful than the last. Elizabeth entered hesitantly, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She felt out of place, her designer dress and flawless makeup a stark contrast to the casual attire of most of the attendees. But no one seemed to notice her. Their attention was entirely on the art. As she moved through the gallery, she saw pieces that stopped her in her tracks. There were portraits of people she recognized. The elderly man from the park, a young mother feeding her child, a street musician lost in his music. Each face was etched with emotion, every line a testament to James's ability to capture not just appearances but souls. And then she saw it. Her portrait. It was larger than the others, displayed in the center of the room. The crowd around it parted as she approached, their whispers fading into silence. Elizabeth stared at the drawing, her heart pounding. This time, it wasn't the cold, aloof figure she had seen in the earlier sketches. This version of herself was different. The hardness in her eyes had softened, replaced by something raw and uncertain. The lines of her face were no longer sharp and unyielding but vulnerable, almost fragile. She looked human. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes as she realized what James had done. He hadn't just drawn her as she was. He had drawn her as she could be. It's beautiful, someone whispered behind her. Elizabeth turned to see James standing there, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. He looked at her with the same calm gaze she had come to expect, but there was no judgment in his eyes this time. Only understanding. You made me look. She struggled to find the words. You made me look better than I deserve. I made you look real, he said simply. She nodded, unable to speak. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the noise of the gallery fading into the background. And in that moment, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The beginning. The exhibition marked a turning point for Elizabeth. In the weeks that followed, she found herself drawn to the park again, not to confront James but to observe, to listen. She began to notice the things she had ignored for so long. The laughter of children, the resilience of the elderly, the quiet beauty in everyday moments. She also began to change. Slowly, tentatively, she started using her influence in ways that mattered. She funded art programs for underprivileged youth, donated to accessibility initiatives, and hosted events that celebrated voices that had long been overlooked. It wasn't about redemption. It was about learning to be better. And though she still carried the weight of her past, she no longer ran from it. Instead, she faced it head-on, determined to build a future that honored the lessons she had learned. As for James, their paths crossed often. He continued to draw, his work reaching more people than ever. And though he remained as enigmatic as ever, Elizabeth came to value his quiet strength and unwavering honesty. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, she turned to him and said, "Thank you." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. For what? for showing me who I am," she said, "and for giving me the chance to be someone better." James didn't respond, but the faintest smile tugged at his lips. And as they sat there, beneath the dappled sunlight, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt free.